Hi. Yeah, that sounds great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm excited to be here and happy to see you all. Thanks for gathering. Maybe I can start with just a little like overview of what I'm up to and a little bit about me for anyone who doesn't know, and then yeah, I would love for this to be more of a dialogue and like more questions and conversation rather than me just talking. So please, if you have questions, I'd love to hear them, or if you have comments, or if you want to talk to me about things you're working on that relate to poetry and art and tech, that would be amazing too. But I guess yeah, just to start, um, again, I'm very happy to be here and love what Vertical Crypto is doing, and really just am always inspired by the amazing work of all the resident artists. So congrats and kudos to all of you for doing such amazing work and being such wonderful forces in the community. I am a poet. I'm a visual artist who does a lot of text-based art and language-based work. And I've also been working since about 2018 as an artificial intelligence researcher, which was sort of a departure from my background, which is very much in language and literature and much more on the more traditional kind of literary side of things. But I'm a lifelong poet, and one of the like kind of sustaining themes that I've been writing about my whole life is technology. I was just like kind of getting into explaining that, but I think because I was sort of born in a little bit more of an analog moment, like, right kind of at the rise of, or, right before the rise of personal computing, and, before social media and, internet usage became so ubiquitous. Like I kind of, have really over the course of my life, like been very interested in charting the difference between, what I remember, and what I really kind of treasured about growing up in more of an analog mindset and world, and how a lot of that has changed as a result of these really fast and extensive transformations when it comes to our digital technologies. And so, the rise of personal computing, the rise of social media, the fact that we're all kind of living in this very globalized existence, and are, constantly sort of navigating this relationship between our physical selves and our physical world and lives, and the virtual realm and our avatars and our more ephemeral existence. Like that to me is a really interesting dynamic to explore artistically, but also to explore poetically. So it's been this subject that I've really been writing about for a very long time. And I think for that reason, although I started off writing and publishing in much more traditional environments, I've been publishing in like, traditional literary journals for, I mean, probably like 2 decades. And, I've published physical books and things like that. But um, the more that I've been writing about and thinking about and working with technologies and thinking specifically about technologies that have to do with language, the more interested I became in looking at how technology could be not just a subject of my writing, but also a medium for my poetry. And so I've been, really experimenting and exploring for a very long time now with digital poetry, with all sorts of different, tech empowered approaches to writing. So, creating motion graphics and animations, and using code and generativity to create visual poetry, and creating electronically enhanced spoken word where I'm performing a poem, but then using digital tools to manipulate my voice and, kind of create soundscapes and things like that. And really just kind of looking at how, how various tech tools and how different sort of digital approaches and ideas can sort of help lift language off the page, off this two-dimensional static printed page, and kind of bring it more into this realm that we live in now, which is more multidimensional and more multiversal. And see if that, in some way helps me create poetry that maybe more accurately captures and reflects what I want to say and what I want to, write about. So that's kind of like yeah, I guess like a quick overview about that side of things. The other I guess like two other things that I'll maybe get into a little bit is that I've always also been very interested in writing and poetry, not just in the more traditional sense, like thinking of it in black and white as black ink on a white piece of paper. But I've always been super fascinated by text-based art. And like even as a kid, when I would go to museums with my parents and go to galleries and stuff, the works that always drew my attention the most were the text-based pieces and works by language artists. People like Jenny Holzer and Bruce Nauman and Glenn Ligon and Barbara Kruger, and the list goes on and on. But I always found myself just really excited by the way that artists like that were taking language or taking words and were applying visual and aesthetic elements to it. And how dramatically that changed, the way that I, as a reader, was confronting these words. And it made me think a lot about, the sort of divide that exists between the literary arts, which are sort of like in one category, and then the visual arts, which are in another category. And I always wondered why it was that so many artists could incorporate poetry in their work and create text-based art. So many artists could use words and language and create language art that could exist in museums and be considered a fine art. But I almost never saw poets like me who were interested in these things considered artists. I never really saw entire poems or books of poems um, in that category of art. It was always kind of separate. So I think I've also just always been very kind of intrigued by that sort of distinction between the two. And a lot of the work that I've done is really about exploring the space between them and kind of collapsing the boundary between written word and aesthetic elements and image and haptics, and really just playing with how language can come to life in lots of different ways through various visual tools and materials and artistic approaches, and just really thinking about what that means for the act of writing and for the experience of readership. And again, like especially as we're in this moment where we are living much more like multidimensional, like multisensorial experiences in so many ways. I spend a lot of time thinking about how literature as we've come to know it, in sort of static printed forms like books and magazines and newspapers and all that, and even relatively like flat one-dimensional experiences of text, on our screens and all that. Just looking at how that's beginning to evolve, or how it has the potential to evolve as we start bringing new tools to bear, on language and on the act of writing. So all those things are really kind of important to me, and just things that really interest me and that I like to spend a lot of time thinking and playing with. And it's been really exciting to get to do that in the metaverse and in Web3, because it is sort of an ideal playground for those ideas to come together. And I'm able to experiment with digital tools and different approaches here that I have not been able to do in more traditional literary arenas. So I think that's one reason why I really love getting to be part of this Web3 community, and really enjoy especially being part of this growing sort of literary movement on the blockchain, and looking at how a lot of writers are beginning to enter the space and to explore the possibilities of the blockchain to kind of crack open new realms of creativity for their own practice. And on that note, many of you probably know, but I'm one of the co-founders of an organization called theVERSEverse, which is, we call it a literary gallery, but I think it's really more of like a community or a collective of writers, more than anything else. Co-founded by me and two other writers who were both actually residents of vertical crypto art, Callan Iwamoto and Ana Maria Caballero. And we all, found our way to the blockchain separately, as writers working in really different disciplines and with really different approaches. But I think we've all just felt so exhilarated by and inspired by what being, here in this creative environment has done and has enabled for our respective practices. And we really wanted to create a space where that kind of imagination and that kind of boundary pushing for language was possible. So we founded theVERSEverse kind of with that idea. We wanted to just have sort of an experimental playground for writers in Web3, a place where we could sort of introduce writers, authors of all different kinds of genres to come and sort of experiment with new digital tools, kind of get introduced to blockchain and the ideas behind it, the conceptual aspects of blockchain as well as the logistical aspects of blockchain, and really just kind of, have a space to talk shop and like ideate and work on things together. And it's been a really wonderful experience, and we've been able to work with a lot of residents actually of vertical crypto, and partner a lot of crypto native artists with poets who are coming from more of an offline, traditional background, and who really are interested and want to come play in this arena with us. So yeah, I can stop there maybe and see if anyone has any questions. Otherwise, I guess the other thing to talk about a bit is AI and artificial intelligence, which I'm sure is on the minds of many of you as well. But shall I pause and does anyone want to chime in? Oh, and I actually see a question from Emily in the chat. Sorry, I wasn't really looking at the chat before, but maybe that's a good place to start. So Emily says, oh, you were there last night. That's so wonderful. Thank you for coming. So your question is, it's surprising to me how often people are playing with ChatGPT to make poetry. Did I expect that? How do you see AI functioning in the act of writing going forward, generally, and in your poetry more specifically? Great question, and good segue to the AI portion of things, actually. So yeah, I've been writing with large language models since 2018, and uh, back then, I really didn't know any other writers, especially any other writers from a literary background who were working with these tools at all. It was still pretty much the domain of some creative coders and engineers and technologists. Um, but I started to sort of become aware of a few very experimental writers like Alison Parrish and Ross Goodwin, and Goran Branwin, for example, who were working with large language models and like early iterations of GPT, um, and really like looking at how natural language processing could really, become something that writers, like us could experiment with and integrate into our practice. And basically, natural language processing is this area of AI that involves sort of the fusion of intelligent systems and computer science and linguistics. And in a nutshell, it has to do with, as I think more and more of us are aware now with the rise of ChatGPT, but basically what it has to do with is training intelligent systems on, huge quantities of information, of examples of written text. So kind of, tapping into all sorts of records of written information. So like looking at web pages and canonical literature and, various bodies of written work, and putting it all together and then using computational systems to look at all that information and basically process it in such a way that the system learns about language and how humans put language together and how humans speak to one another. And then it sort of mimics us, and it uses all those examples as a way to sort of predict how it should write in response to a prompt. So this whole arena, is something that, again, like I've been really interested in for a long time because, as someone who loves playing with language and who really thinks a lot about the process of, creating language and putting words together, this whole area of natural language processing is literally about, putting language together, token by token, sometimes letter by letter, word by word, And to be able to sort of look into the way that a machine mind does that has been so interesting, kind of as a mirror of the human process of putting language together, but also kind of opens up a lot of questions about the differences between how humans create poetry and how machines may create poetry. So it's been a really exciting tool to work with in terms of actually generating language and using it to co-author texts and poetry. But it's also been a really inspiring area for me, I think, philosophically and conceptually, and really has made me think a lot about what is a poem. Who is a poet? Can a machine be a poet, or does a poet have to be human and conscious in the way we normally think of consciousness? And yeah, and so again, I to go back to the question, when I started to learn about this, I was just so excited, thinking about the implications of this for creative writing and for all kinds of writing. But when I started to take my early experiments with GPT-2 into my writing workshops, I got a lot of really hostile reactions from people. And I had like teachers and even peers in the workshop who would sort of say, well, it's not poetry. It's, this is a lazy way of writing, or this is kind of a way of cheating, and it's not really your work. And, the things that I think we're really familiar with a lot of those debates now from what's happening in the conversations over creative AI and visual AI tools. But, encountering that early on was really interesting. And, again, I think just made me feel a little bit alone in what I was doing. So yeah, it's been quite surprising over the past year, especially as ChatGPT has blown up, with kind of that moment in November where it really came to the popular consciousness. Suddenly the floodgates have opened, and it's been really sort of astonishing to see, just to see so many people embracing these tools and playing with them and kind of beginning to understand, just how profound the arrival of these tools are for, for humanity and for so many reasons. So um, it's been really exciting. It's also just been like an absolute whirlwind. I'm having gone from sort of being someone used to writing with AI more or less in solitude to kind of being part of this global conversation has just really been it's been quite a crazy moment. Okay, sorry, I'm now looking through the rest of these questions. And yeah, please feel free if anybody wants to turn voice on. Like I don't want it to just feel like I'm rambling or giving a monologue. Let's see. Oh, Espinoza, hi. The questions on your website in the creative statement section are amazing. Would you say that your work has brought you closer to answers on some of them? Like, what does it mean to be human in a nearly post-human era? Oh, okay. And there's a couple questions about the creative statement. So yeah, so on my website and actually in my book Technology, I have this creative manifesto, which kind of is basically just a list of questions that have been on my mind for a long time, and that are really at the core of a lot of my practice as a writer, as an artist, and also as a researcher. And the core question is really just it's just it is that statement of what does it mean to be human in a nearly post-human era. And I guess what I mean by that is, we're living through a time in which various technological advancements, various advancing and speculative technologies are poised to really upend a lot of the things that we sort of take for granted about the human condition. So, for example, I write about things like the development of artificial wombs and, innovations in neural implants, which are changing how we think and how we, will potentially change the way we think and how we communicate and relate to one another. The explorations being done now with life extension and transhumanism, and how we can use technology to extend our human lifespan and change quality of life. And forays into this question of digital immortality. Is it possible, in theory, to use data, to use software, to sort of preserve memory and preserve personalities and almost reanimate, human beings as as post-human clones in a way. So like all of these things are, they're things that, again, like when I was writing about them um, early on, a lot of the reaction that I got was, why are you as a poet writing about this stuff? Like, this is science fiction. It's not really, like an appropriate topic for a lot of poetic forms and poetic inquiry. And like, this is, a little outside the realm of, I think, what a lot of folks in the poetry world were used to sort of thinking about or writing about. I actually had one class with an amazing poet who's a Pulitzer Prize winner and someone who I really respect and value greatly. But his response to some of my early work was, sort of this question of why was I more interested in writing about technology than in writing about humanity? And to me, that was just such a profound misunderstanding of the point of all of these investigations. The point of, writing about these things is not to kind of veer off into this arena of, thinking just about machines. It's sort of, how does something, like the advent of artificial wombs, how does that change one of the most fundamental conditions of what it means to be human, which is that you're born to a human parent? What does, the arrival of technologies that potentially can extend human life or potentially even immortalize us digitally, what does that mean, in the framework of the fact that we've always understood that to be human is to be mortal? And if, we're coming up against this moment where death might become an option in some way, which is a phrase that a lot of, transhumanists and posthumanists talk about, what does that mean, for the way that we understand ourselves as a species? So like all of these topics are actually, they're not just sort of this fringe or experimental kind of area of sci-fi. They're the fundamental philosophical questions that poets have been writing about for thousands and thousands of years. What does it mean to be human? Well, conditions of human life, like birth and death and love and faith and spirituality, and all of these things are being dramatically like touched and altered by technology. So that's really, I think, the core of a lot of my thinking. And it's been, I think it's also been like, kind of gratifying and exciting that as more and more of the conversations about things like posthumanism and artificial intelligence are coming to the forefront in popular culture, I'm getting more acceptance, I think, to the idea that poets should actually be helping us navigate some of these really profound and unprecedented changes that we're all, as human beings living through. Like, we actually need poetry and we need art to help us grapple with the existential challenges that we're facing as a result of all of these things. So it's been a way to work through some of the questions and work through some of the concerns and challenges and all that, but it's also opening up for me a lot of new questions. And I think we're just living through a moment where there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of newness and novelty. And I know that for myself, like, I would be completely lost without poetry as a way to frame this and think through the questions and try to, understand what it means, to me on a daily basis. And yeah, and it's been a very important tool for me for those reasons. Okay, looking back.
Hi,
Hi.
Sasha. I'm numinal. I'm going
Hi.
to jump in just because my question is also related to the creative statement, so I felt like it's a good connection. I love the creative statement. I think the questions are just fantastic. My questions potentially have to do with how you utilize it, how what do you reflect on these questions? Do you like have them written down? How do they play a role in your practice? And then also, just as a super pedantic question, why do you call it a statement? I only ask because my background is in analytic philosophy, and for me, questions are never statements, and so I kind of like that you're playing with that, but I'm just curious if that was like a intentional sort of playful gesture.
I love that question so much. Both parts of the question. Well, yeah. So I think maybe the answer actually to both of those questions is actually one and the same. Um, I think I wrote the statement for myself just because my head was really swimming with a lot of research and a lot of thinking on these topics, and it's there's so much to unpack and there's so much to think about that I can easily sort of get lost. And so it was almost like creating a roadmap for myself about the things that I really wanted to kind of dive into and like lean on a little bit in my investigations and in my writing and in my art making and all that. So yeah, it was kind of crafting a little bit of a guide for myself. So giving myself a little bit of structure and a little bit of guidance, I guess, which has to do with the idea of a statement or artist manifestos. I think are helpful in terms of framing a practice and really kind of carving out a space to go really deep into. So I think I was approaching it from that standpoint. And yeah, wanting to have a little bit of an outline of these are the things that I have been, fascinated by and obsessed by, and that I know I keep coming back to over and over again. So it feels like right and good to kind of concretize them in a way. But at the same time, it's not like I have hypotheses, that I'm floating, or it's not like I've, answered the questions or anything. So I really felt like it was important to frame that kind of a manifesto as a series of questions, as a poetic litany, really, of questions. And yeah, and I think they echo in my head all the time, and I go back to a lot of them. Maybe not in like a very overt way, but yeah, I think again, like the thing that I really enjoy and that I value about poetry is that it kind of gives you it gives you the ability to carry around meaningful pieces of information in your brain. And because I've sort of concretized some of those ideas into that statement, with questions like, what does it mean to be human in a nearly post-human era? Like that's a phrase that is just kind of always bouncing around in my head, the way that my favorite lines of poetry are. And I kind of consider this statement almost like a poem as well. It's just a poem as a series of questions. Um, yeah, does that answer your question or both of the
No,
questions?
that's really helpful. I really like the idea of the question as a like subjective, poetic, intentional statement. That's really, really fascinating. Thank you for your answer.
Of course. By the way, your background sounds so interesting. Yeah, at some point it would be great to like chat more. But thank you for the question. Okay. And yeah, anyone else who wants to jump in via voice, please feel free. Let's see. I'm just going now down through the list. Does a language model, this is from Aether, does a language model require that it be fed in an arborescent format? Ooh, that's a really beautiful word. And if yes, what is lost in the process? I'm thinking of Deleuze and the proposition that language is rhizomatic. Oh wow. Okay, this is a really good question. Do you want to jump in and unmute and just like unpack
Sure.
some of these ideas, because this is really rich territory.
Okay. Well, first of all, hi, Sasha. It's just
All
so
right.
lovely to hear you and to be live in this conversation.
Yeah,
Um,
it is.
I've
It's lovely to hear
lis-
your voice.
Thank you. This is just something I've been sort of chewing on for some time, and I'm not sure the question itself is entirely ripe yet. But the sense I get is, as you know, as a poet myself and a lover of language, I'm always asking myself, and not in a critical way, because I'm by no means anti-AI, but I do want to ask and also feel my way through the critical questions. And I've been reading like different kinds of different expressions of AI poetry, as no doubt you have, and some is very skillful. And at first, my default assumption was that, oh, this particular poet has been training the model in a very adept way and just has really good raw material, for lack of a, and I don't have any of the tech terminology, so please forgive me. I'm just going to express this in sort of a more not even literary way, just kind of a nuts and bolts way as I understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I will
Yeah.
see, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
Uh,
That's great.
So I will see expressions of that, again, very skillful. And I don't know a whole lot about managing, large data sets, etc., even though it's something I find intellectually fascinating. But you can tell, the difference between that and, say, someone who might, and you see this a lot, especially visual artists who themselves declare not to be especially literate and will then, throw in some keywords and get something out of, say, ChatGPT for by example. And, and sometimes it's spot on. And ultimately, it's not about um, syntax or grammar because that's all taken care of by the machine.
Mm-hmm.
However, there are vast differences in results. And I've been asking myself, and there are the obvious reasons, and I think there are elements that are far more subtle. And
Mm-hmm.
my experience of language, and I grew up speaking four languages, but really speaking them, not sort of my fourth or my fifth language would be like most people's second language. And as a result, like I know how much happens in the silence between the words.
Mm-hmm.
And that's perhaps more poetic than necessary for the purposes of this question that I'm struggling to pose. But I find that there is this binary nature of what, by default, necessarily, that is being fed to any given machine. And language is so much more than that. And so what I've noticed, though, is that in many instances, it doesn't matter, that the outcome
Mm-hmm.
is um, delicious, is titillating, is um, often creative in ways that a human mind might not have been, because connections are being made, at a sort of very like I don't know if it's at a substrate level or at a very, very meta level, but wherever it is, it's a little bit outside often just the
Mm-hmm.
realm of one human. I don't really like the word mind because I really see the mind sort of in the sense of Huxley, the mind at large. But
Mm-hmm.
any given receptor can only manage so much at any given time. And here I find a lot of poetry in that particular aspect of the expression. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
wondering, like, where is it lacking? And a secondary question um, is, like, can we speak a little bit about what the biases are going in? And here I'll just give the example of, unfortunately, at the moment, the name escapes me, but of the project. But there was a project on FX Hash by an artist I really love, who's a deep thinker. His name is Paolo Cortoni. And we
Mm-hmm.
had many exchanges after his project was pulled. He had used a number of novels, mostly novels, more than poetry per se, but there was Mark Twain in there. And one of the iterations came out with the N word in it, and the project was
Mm-hmm.
pulled,
Yep.
understandably.
Yep.
And I'm sure you're well aware of that. And so, obviously, and so it's not so much about that incident, but the
Mm-hmm.
the importance of how whatever it is we feed is a reflection of who we are, not only now, who we were then, because it's
Yeah.
pretty antiquated. And
Yeah.
so that's where I see the deep responsibility in terms of um, the tenor of the work. But beyond that, I'm really interested in what you think And I have a few personal ideas, but I'd really like to hear what you think about what it is that, like, I feel like it's almost like a John Cage kind of question, or
Yep. Yep.
or like, I'm just sort of like almost I find language itself is evading me as I try to speak about this, but I
Oh,
think you understand where I'm going, and it's just sort of like I studied Derrida a lot in
mhm.
school, and it's always about how that there is no ultimate word. Everything points to everything else, and everything has all these really long tails, and it's all very nebulous. But as much as he deconstructed it, we were still talking about something. Yet, in the way we express, and here I mean verbally, I'm very interested in embodiment, but here I'm really speaking about the physicality, the feel of words in my mouth.
Yeah.
There is still and will always be, so long as I exist in this embodied, vibrational, flesh and bone self, um, there is something happening beyond the individual, phonemes that are being articulated, pronounced. There is something else, and I'm sure this is obviously something you've thought about deeply. And I would just like to speak to one other human who doesn't think this is an insane question. That's my question.
Oh my gosh, I could listen to you talk about talk about all this for ages. Wow, there's a lot of really brilliant insights in your questions. And I'm trying to think about where to even begin because there's so much there to unpack. I mean, so I definitely have spent a lot of time sort of thinking about um, the semiotics of language and of natural language processing, and kind of coming back to the ways in which language is sort of essential to us, because it's kind of the best way we've um, it discovered to package specific ideas and transmit information. But at the same time, there's there's so much that's fallible about language, and there's so many ways in which language is not accurate, and language is not actually a very um, precise way of interfacing from human to human in lots of ways. And you can kind of look around at the world and see all the problems that arise from miscommunication and inability to kind of really speak to one another in a way that transmits ideas that they're most essential. um, and I think a lot of the work that I'm doing with words and with language is kind of navigating that a little bit, and like looking at how, of course, for me as a writer, words are how I navigate the world and how I understand myself. But there are also a lot of limitations to that, and there's many things that words can't quite get at, and they're pointing to, and that's sort of where the poetics of it all comes in. Whereas you say, so much of the meaning that I'm trying to put my finger on is not actually in the language itself. It's on the spaces between language, or it's in the way that an arrangement of words suggests something that cannot be said, through individual letters or words themselves, or through the way that patterns, poetic repetition, and all sorts of different poetic devices that kind of structure language in different ways. How all of those things are what kind of shape the meaning. They're what make the meaning of the poem, which is why I tend to be much more interested in poetry than in prose. Like I mean, I write a lot of prose as well, but I'm really sort of obsessed with the wordplay, and the non-verbal play also, that happens in poetry. And that's also why I'm very interested in things like the haptic and aesthetic qualities of poetry, and why I'm not just a traditional poet. It's why I'm an experimental poet and a visual poet and a concrete poet, because so much of what's not actually legible or expressible through words themselves can sort of be elaborated on or expanded on through other mediums or other techniques or other approaches. So, for example, I can take the same line of poetry and I can put it in Times New Roman, size 12, and print it in a book or print it in a magazine. and it will have a very different sort of life and a very different manifestation in the world and in the mind of the reader than if I'm creating something, that's a digitally animated expression of those words using, let's say, the color red and sort of like a glowing effect, and integrating sound or other elements to kind of give it a little bit more of a multidimensional sort of meaning, I guess. And I'm trying to navigate sort of, my impulse to do that, but also maintaining some of the open-endedness and some of the, the imagination that exists in more of a two-dimensional poem, kind of as a libretto for, for a reader to kind of make their own meaning. So it's sort of, I think there's a lot uh, in my work and a lot, in my thinking that's about kind of going back and forth between those two, um, trying to kind of get towards a mode of expression and a mode of meaning making that is really valuable and useful, and that kind of leverages many of the tools or many of the ways that we have at our disposal to innovate literature and language as we know it, while also recognizing that language in and of itself is already an extremely kind of advanced technology that does a lot of the things that we're trying to replicate in the metaverse or through virtual realities or through synthetic realities or the augmentation of our our fleshly existence. Like, language already kind of allows us to travel through time and space, and it allows us to teleport into the mind of another person. It allows us to try on different avatars, and so all sorts of things that we're kind of trying to build for ourselves, like in this, in this sort of increasingly post-human existence of ours. Poetry and language at large has sort of been enabling us to do that for a long time. So, yeah, kind of, I guess those are two sort of, I think they're related, but also in some way kind of contradictory impulses. So I really like the tension between those two things and going back and forth. And I don't, I think the other part of your question that was sort of ringing in my head, and I'm not sure if I have like a really pointed answer on this yet, but this idea of like, whether the creation of language using artificial intelligence, using intelligent systems is sort of like more arborescent or more rhizomatic. I think that's a really beautiful and really interesting way of framing a question, and I almost just want to sit with the question itself, because I don't necessarily feel like it's one or the other. I think, I mean, there's definitely a lot in the actual logistics and mechanics of word vectors and the way that information is sort of linked together, and how a machine mind goes from token to token, that is very much mimicking, like, growth, right? So it goes from basically a seed, like an input, and then kind of is building itself letter by letter or token by token or word by word. And it is sort of creating, as you're suggesting, it is sort of creating this sort of tree or this forest or what have you, and kind of moving in that direction where it's kind of expanding and building up and out. But at the same time, so much of what I really appreciate and enjoy about tapping into large language models as opposed to other kind of machinic co-authors or collaborators is the fact that there are lots of different sort of nodes and seeds and lots of potential for an idea to sort of suddenly like jump out of the realm of what it should, move towards, and sort of become something wildly different. And I feel like that is more kind of in that idea of like the rhizomatic way of thinking of language. And I think certainly when we're thinking about artificial intelligence as kind of a collective mindset or, collaborative consciousness, that's also very rhizomatic. You're not just starting with like one kind of central author or one central vision necessarily, but you have millions, literally millions of authors and millions of writers, millions of creators who are in a way involved in the process. And so the output is necessarily going to be quite, I don't want to say scattered, because like it all kind of gets synthesized in a really beautiful way, but it's a very sort of diversified alternative to the way we traditionally think about authorship.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Well, I think it's ultimately a koan. I wasn't really
Yes,
expecting
absolutely.
one answer, but just really a pleasure to sit with someone with another mind who is pondering some of these deeper sort of metaphysical aspects, and it's inescapable because
Yeah.
it's the logos, it's that of which we are made. So it's endlessly fascinating to me. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, I love talking to you and hearing your voice always. Thank you so much for all of that. And I will continue thinking about all the points you raised.
Thank you.
And I certainly, think that, again, there is so much philosophical underpinning to so much of the work that we're all doing in Web3, whether or not we realize it. But we're all kind of trying to sort through this very uh, this very novel and in some ways very unprecedented experience of digital dualism that we are. I mean, right now, being in this Discord channel, we are simultaneously in our physical bodies, and in this other virtual realm. And to me, that's very much sort of a new problem, or a new sort of existential condition that we're confronting and trying to grapple with, while at the same time you can certainly understand how it relates to mind body problem, how it relates to lots of sort of existential and philosophical queries that we've been preoccupied with for time immemorial. So yeah, definitely like a pleasure to think deeply about this, and it certainly deserves a lot more time and thought than we have here. But thank you for that. Okay, I'm just looking back to the questions in the chat. And please, if anybody else wants to jump in on voice, you're more than welcome to. I know, Anton, you had asked about jumping in.
Yeah. Hello, Sasha. Nice to meet
Hi.
you.
Nice to meet you too.
I just, first of all, I wanted to say that I'm really under impression of your work. Are you ready for the future? It's the time in my life when I'm really feeling a lot of changes, and this work really kind of put me to the question, am I ready for them? And it's and I felt like I'm ready for the future. So it is really exciting, beautiful piece, futuristic, and I love how the voice is made, and everything is fantastic. It's absolutely beautiful.
Oh,
And
thank you. That's really kind of you to say. I really appreciate that.
yes, and I wanted to ask about the future. So, do you think of how the future should be, how it will be for the human beings? Because I feel like so if we actually we can model a future, we can model a thought that the way everything should develop, and not I realized that not too many people actually dream about the future. They like see the path that they see is somewhere. For example, most of people think it's kind of going to cyberpunk style, or but there are some other theories like solar punk or transhumanism, or so I'm just really interested of what's your idea of our future might be, what the role of AI in our future, and will AI make people closer or more far away from each other? So yeah. Thanks.
Just a small, easy question. That's yeah, I'm like that could be a very long answer. That's a really well, you stated it really beautifully, and thank you again for your question and for the kind words. I obviously spend a lot of time thinking about the future as well. I should say, because I think this is an important thing to clarify too, that, because I write so much about the future and because I write quite often with AI and, about speculative technologies and all this, I think a lot of people sort of assume that I'm this unrepentant techno optimist and that, I'm just kind of coming in singing the praises of AI and, all sorts of post-human transformations and possibilities. And I think, I am very excited and very interested and very optimistic in a lot of ways, but I'm also I try to be very realistic about a lot of the incredibly harmful consequences that many of our technological inventions have had, while at the same time enabling, really essential progress. And, just kind of wanting to balance things a little bit and wanting to kind of, I think to make the point you were just saying, the point that you were just articulating, which is that we have to actually create the future. We don't just kind of have a future waiting for us to inhabit it. It's really a result of all the things that we're doing right now. And when I'm writing about the future, like in my book Technology or in the poem that you mentioned, I think there's a lot of different sort of visions of the future. And actually, that long poem, "Are You Ready for the Future?" is in the original sort of printed format, and in the NFT that you mentioned, it's a poem cycle where I've asked that question, "Are you ready for the future?" I've asked my AI alter ego that question hundreds of times, and then gone through and sort of sifted through the answers. But there's a lot of different responses to the question, and there's a lot of negative responses, and there's a lot of positive responses, and there's some that are more ambivalent. And I think that's obviously quite reflective of how we probably as a collective civilization are approaching this idea of what the future holds. I think one of my impulses in getting involved with AI as a language and literature student who has no background in computer science, I really had no business getting involved in AI other than that. It really seemed important to have not just technologists and engineers and folks who are really kind of close to the machine in all these ways, not just to have them sort of like building this future that the rest of us then have to deal with, but for all of us to sort of begin realizing that we need to be involved in the creation of these tools that have such a profound impact on how we move through life. And it's not just the purview of the tech titans or of the folks that are building the large language models. We all need to kind of understand a little bit more about how they work and how they're trained, and what they can be used for in a positive way, and also what they can be used for in a negative way. And I think there's a lot coming to the forefront right now in terms of this idea of AI literacy as being really integral to trying to make sure that the future that is being shaped now is one that is inclusive and fair and sort of ethically aware, and that really kind of understands there are a huge number of potentially negative consequences to intelligent systems, many of which we're already seeing with deep fakes and the proliferation of I think a lot of people call them sort of machine hallucinations, but information that sounds like it's factual but is not factual, and all sorts of I won't get into like all of the ins and outs because I think everyone knows them, but there's a lot of ways that that these systems really are demanding that we sort of build guardrails and just be very careful about our approach to to cultivating and innovating them. And again, I think that's why all of this has been very important, or has felt very important for me to understand more about getting involved not just in using existing data sets or using existing large language models that are more off the shelf, but also getting getting familiar with how to actually customize them and how to have a hand in input and how to really kind of shape something so that I have more of an understanding of how this works like on a much bigger level. And I think that's been a really exciting outcome of the past year and a half or so, with creative AI tools really kind of becoming much more popular. Is so many people that don't necessarily have a lot of familiarity with AI are now using them and understanding more and more about what this very large umbrella term, this very like often misunderstood umbrella term of AI, what it actually entails. And I think that's really important in terms of how the systems continue to be built. And you see people like Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, for example, who are such artistic visionaries, but also are very much committed to having a role in how these kinds of intelligent systems are built, and thinking about who is represented in them and how those people are either compensated or how they're acknowledged and all of that. So I think the potential and like the prospects for AI as tools to really dramatically revolutionize how we communicate and how we express ourselves is incredibly profound, but definitely requires a lot of really thoughtful and hard work, and like really peering into the very distant future to understand the guardrails that we should probably be putting up around it to make sure that it's not just reinforcing current power structures and current biases and current prejudices, which it very much does at the moment. Sorry, I think I'll stop. There's probably so much more to say, but I'll stop. Maybe I'll stop rambling there because I know we're at the hour and I don't want to keep anyone too much longer. So yeah, I mean, thank you again for that question and that prompt. And if there's anyone else who has any maybe sort of last thoughts or last questions, please feel free to jump in on voice. Oh, I'm just reading through the chat questions now as well. So let's see. I love the way you create your media-rich work. I'm starting to explore using sound in my asemic work. Oh, that's cool. And I wondered how you found the audience reacts to multimedia work. Did you find any resistance? And can you give me a better word instead of multimedia? That's a great question. And I've actually been really thinking a lot about what to call a lot of these multimedia approaches to poetry and literature. I've been defaulting to kind of just calling them media-rich poems, but it's not quite right. I haven't landed on this, so I'm actually really happy to ideate this with you and like with everyone here. I really feel like there are new sort of genres of literature being invented as a result of like all these different mediums and techniques coming together. And it sort of deserves another name. I think there is a category of poetry and literature that will always sort of be static and printed, and I love that approach too, and it has so much tremendous value. But I kind of want to define or sort of tease out the distinctions between that approach to literature and this newer approach that really is incorporating multimodal, transmedial techniques. And I, for whatever it's worth, in case anybody wants to like take this as a seed for brainstorming, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, which is this sort of German word, which I've probably just butchered the pronunciation, but this idea of the total artwork, right? This idea of a work of art that brings together many different disciplines in order to create a very rich, immersive, kind of embodied experience of art. And I think like there's something that really resonates with me about that idea when it comes to multimedia work that incorporates sound and visuals and a text and visual art and potentially installation or a physical element. You really are in that sense, like working on a piece of art like that, you really are working in a lot of different mediums at the same time. And I don't think it's not just multimedia poetry. I think it's a new genre. I think it deserves its own name. And I just I don't I don't know exactly what it is yet, but I'm definitely thinking. Did I find any resistance? I mean, generally, I think people are really excited about a lot of the developments that are happening with poetry and Islamic work and multimedia written work and all that. But I think in the traditional writing world, there's definitely a lot of resistance, and there's a lot of people, even in Web3, who kind of think that bringing all this other stuff in can potentially be a distraction from a core text or from a piece of written language, which I don't necessarily disagree with. I think they're doing two different things, but I think, like, for the most part, no, there's not a ton of resistance. Maybe it's more like sometimes there's obstacles in terms of logistics for minting or logistics for sharing. For example, if I want to share something that really is more musically focused, it's harder to do that, I think, than to share something that has a visual hook or that's more driven by the visual narrative, just because most technologies and most file formats and things that we're used to using in Web3 in particular are really more geared to the visual than the auditory in a way. So, like, that's a little bit of a challenge, but I also feel like, this is a good example of how creating work and kind of seeing where it takes you is also a good way to sort of think about what new vessels or new formats we need to create, like, for the distribution of that artwork. And that's, like, an interesting part of the process for me as well. So thank you for that question. Sorry, I know we're running over time, so I'm also, like, happy to sort of bring this to a close. And if people need to jump, please feel free. Emily says, what are some or one of the most notable writing projects you're seeing that use AI? Like, I assume maybe you're talking about creative writing projects. There aren't, like, a ton that I think are super, super notable. I think there's a lot of experimentation and a lot of kind of, like, very early stage, just sort of everyone's, playing with these tools and kind of seeing what they can do. I think, like, for me, some of the standout AI projects have already, they've sort of happened. I think my friend Ross Goodwin is someone who always comes to mind. He's been working with AI language for years and years and has done some really incredible projects, not just in terms of poetry, but in terms of using AI to sort of write novels and to write screenplays, and actually creating tools, purpose-built tools that utilize AI to become sort of writing utensils. So just one quick example of that is he created a project called Word Camera, which I've actually was really excited to bring it into the fold at theVERSEverse, and we've been collaborating with Ross and using his Word Camera project in different ways at theVERSEverse, which more on that soon. But this project, Word Camera, involves him using a camera that he has custom designed and equipped with AI-based image recognition, so that when he points the camera at something or someone and he takes a picture of it, it's using AI to translate that photo, that image, into a set of keywords. And then he has it linked to a language model that takes the keywords and then turns it into a piece of literature. So he can sort of fine tune or manipulate it to or recalibrate it to produce poetry, or to produce a novel, or to produce really any kind of text. Just requires different examples, but it's using a camera to basically write. So going straight from image to text. And I think things like that, to me, are just so incredibly visionary. And I would recommend maybe Ross Goodwin's work is something to look into as particularly noteworthy with AI. Ivan, hi. Thanks for your question, and thank you so much for your contributions to the VerseVerse. I know you've been involved in Poesia, which is really wonderful. okay, you said, can you talk a bit more about what you've learned personally from pairings between visual artists and poets with a bit more traditional background entering the space? I would say on that front, like a big mission at theVERSEverse has been to onboard traditional writers. We really are trying to build bridges between the Web3 community and writers who are already here, and bring in folks who we think really would have fun and who would benefit from being here, but who are maybe um, not well equipped for whatever reason to kind of come in on their own. So we've had to sort of figure out how to enable traditional writers who have like a very kind of conventional practice to come and play in the Web3 arena. And I think one of the best ways to do that has been to pair writers with crypto native artists or artists who have established practices in Web3, and or creative technologists who are doing really cool things with text and with language, and to sort of play matchmaker a bit and find the right fit for particular poems and poets, but really kind of match a poet with an artist who can kind of understand what a poet is trying to do with a particular text, and then bring it to life in a way that is more visual, or a way that I think has potential to really kind of engage the audience here in the Web3 community. So I think that's been really important for a lot of poets. It also has a really long tradition. Obviously, words and image have always gone together. Words and letters derive from images, of course, and there's a very extensive tradition of things like illuminated manuscripts and poetry broadsides, and then of course text-based art and various artists who've collaborated in one way, shape, or form with poets. But I think, again, like for the most part, it's always been a little bit of it's been kind of a strange thing where in the art world, at least, like the poem or the words have sort of taken a back seat to the art. And I think like what we're learning and what we're having fun with at theVERSEverse with projects like Poesia is really being able to kind of put a poem and its artistic representation on the same footing, and to kind of have the poet and the artist really working together to achieve a vision. And I think that's been, again, sort of an evolution of the typical way we think about illustration of poetry. But I mean, I know, again, we're running out of time and I have to jump soon, but Ivan, if you want to chime in a little bit, like with any insights from your experience, I'd be really happy to hear about that as well. Otherwise, thank you so much for being involved with Poesia. Yeah, well, thank you so much for inviting me to come in, and thanks to everyone for chatting. Sorry, I was rambling a bit, but I tend to do that, especially when I'm tired and it's just been a really long week. But I'd love to keep the conversation going. You can reach me on Twitter. I'm pretty responsive with my DMs. I try to be, at least, and I'm at Sasha Stiles on Twitter. And of course, like via theVERSEverse, that's always a good way to engage as well. Or you can probably just reach me through email, like via the Vertical Crypto folks, if that's helpful as well. But thanks so much for all the questions and for all the interesting insights and conversation. I really appreciate it.